They called the cops on me for standing in my own street. 3 patrol cars screeched to a stop at the corner, while the HOA board president jabbed a manicured finger at my chest, shouting that I was trespassing, obstructing traffic, and refusing lawful authority. 2 board members hovered behind her like backup dancers, phones recording, smug smiles already rehearsed. A tow truck revved beside my pickup. She leaned close enough that I smelled peppermint gum. "You don't live under this association," she snapped. "So you don't belong here." What she didn't know was that every home lining that block, left, right, straight down to the cul-de-sac, sat on land my family never sold. And she definitely didn't know the deed in my safe covered all of it. I folded my arms while the officers waited for someone to explain who owned the road beneath their boots. "Ma'am," one deputy said slowly, glancing between us, "whose property is this?" "Stay with me," because the moment they checked county records, the entire HOA froze in place. My name is Sam, and I never expected my own street to feel like enemy territory. Hours before the cops screeched to a stop at my curb, I was walking down the quiet lane that had belonged to my family for generations. Coffee in hand, noticing how neat every lawn was, too neat, almost staged. A subdivision sign announced the so-called HOA, and little plaques warned of rules and fines, like silent threats waiting for me. I'm a former municipal land analyst, a veteran who spent years decoding city planning and property lines, so I knew exactly what I was walking into. But even with that experience, nothing prepared me for the level of hostility that had already started to creep toward me. My grandfather's portfolio, the land he'd bought decades before anyone thought to carve streets and lots through it, was now in my name, a legacy I had sworn to protect. Every detail mattered to me: the creak of the gate, the way the sunlight hit the pavement, the hum of sprinklers keeping the lawns artificially perfect. I could sense the tension before it became obvious. Neighbors ducking into their homes, glances sliding away, cameras in windows tracking my steps. And then I found it. My mailbox had been tampered with. A bright orange sticker slapped across the front. In bold letters it read, "Welcome to the association." I felt a knot in my stomach, not out of fear, but out of recognition. This was going to be more than a dispute over fences or dues. The stakes were higher, much higher, and I had a feeling that the next hours would test every ounce of patience, knowledge, and resolve I'd inherited from my family. My grandfather bought this land in the 1960s, back when the only thing here were rolling fields, a handful of trees, and a dirt road that twisted like a ribbon through the property. He wasn't rich, but he had vision, a stubborn belief that land was more than dirt and fences. Over the decades, the surrounding area grew. Developers swooped in, carving subdivisions, planting cookie-cutter homes, and putting up signs that promised community rules and orderly living. But he never sold a single lot that mattered. The trust deed he set up remained intact, untouched by builders or brokers, a silent legal sword protecting every street corner, every sidewalk, and every utility easement that ran through his land. When my parents passed the torch to me, I inherited control of the entire block, the land, the rights, the history. I still remember the journals he kept, yellowed pages filled with meticulous notes, surveys, maps, property valuations, even sketches of trees he had planted. I'd run my fingers over his old war medals, slightly tarnished, a reminder of courage and patience, and I'd think about the work it took to protect what he built. This wasn't just property, it was a legacy. A story written in soil and stone, waiting for someone to honor it. I walked the property regularly, tracing the fences he'd approved, the small wooden bridges over drainage ditches, the oak tree he'd planted when my mother was born. Every step reminded me of what was mine, and what I was responsible for defending. And now, decades later, the quiet beauty of the block was about to be tested in ways I hadn't imagined. After years of city life, working long hours in an office full of fluorescent lights, I was burned out. The job had drained me. The noise had drained me. And even the people I called friends felt distant in that urban haze. When my parents passed, I saw an opportunity, not just to step away from the chaos, but to reconnect with something real. Coming back to this land, to the streets my grandfather had walked, was like pressing reset on my life. I wanted to protect what he had protected. I wanted to reconnect with the childhood memories buried in these fields. The smell of fresh grass after rain, the way sunlight hit the rooftops in the evening, the quiet hum of cicadas in the summer. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about reclaiming power. It was about responsibility. If I didn't step in, I knew the HOA, the developers, or some overzealous board member would slowly erode what generations had built. Every lawn, every fence, Every parcel of land was worth defending. Not for money, not for status, but for the story my grandfather had written in sweat and care. I met the HOA president the day I returned. She drove a silver SUV that gleamed too perfectly, parked right on the curb as if claiming territory. Clipboard in hand, polished nails tapping, hair styled to perfection. From the first glance, I knew this was a Karen type, the kind who treats rules like weapons and smiles like armor. She assumed I was a renter immediately. No introduction, no question about my identity, just a dismissive nod and a tone that said, "You're new here, you'll learn soon enough." She had a habit of leaning forward, elbows on the hood of the SUV, explaining policies I already knew inside out from my own land surveys. "You'll see our policies," she said, passive-aggressive but smug, as if rules alone gave her power. Behind her, 2 board members lingered like understudies, nodding at her every word, taking notes and occasionally smirking. Cameras on her dashboard blinked, probably recording every interaction. The air smelled faintly of peppermint gum and authority. Every step I took on my own land felt observed, measured, and judged. I kept my voice calm. I let her talk. I let the threat linger. But in my mind, I was cataloging everything, the way she approached, the tone she used, the timing of her gestures. This wasn't a casual conversation. This was a power play. It started with my fence, a perfectly legal wooden fence, built years ago, approved by surveys and tucked well inside my property lines. Yet she claimed it violated HOA standards. "You need to remove this immediately," she said, voice sharp. "It's against regulations. We'll send a notice." "Actually," I said, calm and steady, "I'm not under your HOA. These lots are part of my grandfather's trust." She smiled that thin, condescending smile, one corner of her mouth curling like she knew something I didn't. "Rules still apply," she hissed, leaning closer, clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. "You'll learn quickly here." 2 minutes of silence stretched like hours. I didn't back down. I didn't smile. I didn't react. She fidgeted, visibly frustrated that her assumed authority didn't intimidate me. And then she threatened, quietly but venomously, "We can escalate this if you don't comply." I nodded slowly, letting her simmer in that smugness. Little did she know, escalation would be the moment she'd regret. This wasn't just about a fence or an orange sticker on a mailbox. The stakes ran deeper. Access roads, utilities, potential fines, and the creeping sense that an overzealous HOA could make life miserable for anyone who dared challenge them. Every parcel of land my family owned was intertwined with these rights. Roads built decades ago, easements running underground, drainage ditches meticulously mapped. Any threat to my authority over the property could ripple into financial liability, legal disputes, and the erosion of decades of careful legacy. Emotionally, it weighed heavier. It wasn't just money. It was my grandfather's name, the sweat he poured into this land, and the trust he placed in me. Losing control, or even feeling like I might, was a violation far deeper than legal documents could express. Tension grew with every passing day. Neighbors began avoiding eye contact, their glances quick, uneasy. Mail started disappearing or being tampered with. Cameras appeared on rooftops and in windows. One morning, I noticed a small drone hovering over the block, its lens fixed on my backyard. The subtle threats were escalating. Even simple tasks, checking the mailbox, stepping onto the curb, felt monitored. I started mapping their movements, cataloging which cars appeared when, which neighbors smiled or averted their gaze. Every detail mattered. I could feel the invisible boundary they were trying to impose, the HOA asserting power where they had none, assuming that fear could make me comply. But I knew better. I had the deeds, the surveys, the knowledge of municipal land law, and the patience to let them push until they overreached. And I had a sense that when the right moment came, every subtle intimidation, every veiled threat would work in my favor if I stayed calm and observant. It started small, almost like background noise. A fine taped to my mailbox for landscaping violations, the kind of petty citation a stranger might ignore. But then the letters multiplied. Week after week, each envelope more aggressive than the last. One claimed I owed road usage fees. Another threatened a lien if I didn't comply immediately. The HOA board acted as if they were a sovereign government, wielding their clipboard like a scepter. I knew better, but for anyone else, it would feel suffocating. The letters were carefully worded, typed in intimidating fonts, with legal jargon that sounded heavy even to my trained eyes. "Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action," one said, as if mere paper could force me off land I legally owned. Every envelope was a performance. They wanted me rattled, alone, second-guessing myself. I tracked every one, delivery date, sender, reference number. Each citation was like a small battle, testing my patience and my resolve. I spent hours drafting responses, citing surveys, deeds, municipal codes. Each reply was a calm reminder that I knew my rights, but the HOA seemed impervious to facts. They were used to fear compliance, not defiance backed by legal knowledge. And still the letters kept coming. Some days I found 3 in the mailbox. Some days 5. Each one carried a subtle, quiet threat. We are everywhere. We are watching. You cannot ignore us. But every letter also gave me data, patterns I could later use to dismantle their bluff. By the end of the first month, the board believed they were controlling the situation. In reality, I was cataloging every move, reading every nuance, preparing for the day their arrogance would collide with truth. Soon the intimidation became physical. Cameras appeared on street corners, pointed directly at my driveway. I noticed the flash of lenses from second-story windows, odd reflections in darkened glass. I started recording patterns. Who walked past, at what time, which cars lingered. The HOA had hired a private security contractor. A man in a dark uniform started showing up at odd hours, taking notes, snapping photos. He pretended to be innocuous, waving politely, but his presence felt invasive. I could see through it immediately. Their intent was intimidation. I mapped the patterns, noting the overlaps, mail delivery, HOA board members, the security man's routes. Every time they thought they were invisible, I was observing them, filing their mistakes in my mental ledger. Even my neighbors seemed influenced by it. They averted their gaze when I passed, hesitated before opening doors, all while cameras caught it. The intimidation was subtle but effective. I felt the pressure, but I also recognized the strategy. The moment they overstepped, I would have the evidence to expose every step. The harassment went public next. Flyers appeared in driveways, plastered in mailboxes. "Beware the squatter on Elm Street," one read, with exaggerations about dangerous dogs and hazardous property. A Facebook group dedicated to the neighborhood started circulating posts about me, claiming I was a menace, an outsider, an illegal resident. Neighbors whispered as I walked past. Some shook their heads, uncertain how much was true, how much was fear. The HOA had managed to plant doubt in the minds of almost everyone around me. It wasn't violence, it was manipulation. I knew the claims were ridiculous, easy to disprove, but the campaign itself was effective. It was designed to isolate me, make me question the goodwill of the block. The stress wasn't just emotional, it was tactical. The HOA wanted me cornered before they made the next move. Isolation followed quickly. Contractors refused to work on my property, citing association concerns. Banks began asking questions about refinancing, worried that liens might materialize despite my clear deeds. Sleep became impossible. The stress of constant monitoring, the looming threats, the emails, the phone calls, the strangers photographing my every move, it all compounded. I felt the weight of the property, my grandfather's legacy, the legal documentation, and the creeping sense of helplessness. I had to remind myself why I returned: to protect, to honor, to reclaim control. But for the first time, even I wondered how far the HOA would push before I could respond. I spent hours reviewing the legal limits of their power. HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. CCRs only applied to platted lots recorded under municipal records. Private trust land, like mine, was exempt. Recorded covenants had no sway over parcels that were never subdivided for HOA purposes. Annexation rules could not magically pull my grandfather's trust into their authority. I cited municipal codes, historical plats, and surveys proving that the HOA had zero jurisdiction over my property. To anyone else, the HOA's letters might have seemed terrifying, but for me, they were an opportunity. They overstepped publicly, creating a record of harassment that would later validate my position. Every violation they sent, every citation they filed, became evidence of their overreach. Another layer was the roads themselves. Some streets ran along easements, some were private but maintained by the city. HOA claims to control these roads were legally hollow. Easements allowed my property to have unrestricted access, and dedication rules meant the association could not block or remove vehicles without formal authorization. They were trying to create an artificial sense of authority over a network of roads they did not own. Their bluff relied on fear rather than law. I could document every segment, every legal precedent, every historical easement, and use it to flip the power entirely. Eventually, the HOA became bolder. Cease and desist notices arrived daily. Board members threatened to involve the sheriff. One email said, "We may be forced to remove obstruction on your lot if this continues." Another warned of immediate fines escalating into lines. At the next board meeting, they voted to remove obstruction myself. The language was intentionally vague, designed to intimidate, but to me, it was confirmation that their bluff was growing desperate. Every action they took revealed their fear of my compliance with the law and the deeds in my hands. Then came the tow notice, a bright orange sticker plastered to my truck, unauthorized vehicle, HOA regulation violation. Immediate removal required. They even claimed my gate was illegal. It was absurd, a manufactured emergency, but it worked. The tension hit a peak. Every neighbor passing my driveway glanced at me, cameras recorded my response, and the HOA finally pushed too far. That was the moment I knew the confrontation was inevitable. All of their small, tactical harassment, the letters, the surveillance, the social media campaigns, had built to this singular point. They wanted to force me out physically. Little did they know that when the next move came, the full power of the deeds, surveys, and legal authority I inherited would leave them frozen in place. The moment arrived exactly as I'd predicted. 2 tow trucks roared down the street, lights spinning, engines growling like predators. 3 patrol cars pulled up behind them, brakes squealing against the asphalt. My driveway suddenly felt smaller, crowded by the looming vehicles. The HOA president stormed forward, heels clicking sharply on the concrete, clipboard held like a shield. "You need to move that truck now," she demanded, voice sharp enough to cut through the morning air. Her smile was tight, smug, like she already owned victory. "This is association property. Trespassing will not be tolerated." 2 board members flanked her, phones out, recording. Their expressions were carefully rehearsed, part disbelief, part excitement. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect scene, the lone outsider confronted by authority. The deputy glanced at me, his eyebrows raised, unsure how to act. The other officers shifted, reading their radios, waiting for instructions. Even the tow truck drivers hesitated, hesitant to touch the truck parked firmly in my driveway. I stayed calm, hands in pockets, boots planted firmly, heart steady. I'd seen intimidation before, but this was different. It was theatrical, desperate. I let them perform, let the tension stretch. Their confidence was loud, but hollow. "Move now," the HOA president barked, "or we'll have this truck removed by force." I shook my head slowly. "You're about to learn exactly whose land this is." My voice carried quietly but firmly, every syllable deliberate. They hadn't noticed the small stack of documents peeking from my backpack. I waited until the deputy stepped forward, subtle authority in his stance, before reaching for the first deed. Cameras flashed, neighbors peered through windows, and for the first time I could feel the scales of power beginning to shift. I opened my backpack carefully, pulling out the neatly stacked documents, county plats, trust deeds, survey maps. The paper smelled faintly of ink and history, yellowed along the edges. "Deputy," I said calmly, handing him the first document, "these are the recorded plats for this entire block. My grandfather purchased all of it before the subdivision was ever created. I own every lot, every street, every easement legally recorded under my name." The deputy adjusted his sunglasses, squinting as he scanned the documents. The HOA president's eyes widened slightly, her confidence faltering for the first time. She glanced at the tow drivers, then at her board members, hoping someone would step in, but no one moved. I continued, unhurried. "Every fence, every road, every parcel your board claims authority over. Legally, none of it is yours. These documents prove it." I laid out the survey maps across the hood of my truck, lines and measurements visible, corners clearly marked. The HOA president leaned closer, still trying to mask panic behind condescension. "You're lying," she hissed, but her voice trembled. I didn't respond. Instead, I handed the deputy the trust deed. His eyes scanned the precise legal language. All parcels, easements, roads, and infrastructure within the block transferred to Sam's family trust in 19. The deputy's tone changed subtly. He spoke into his radio, verifying the data. The tension shifted. The theater the HOA had staged began collapsing under the weight of undeniable proof. I stayed calm the entire time. Every gesture, every document, every measurement was a visual argument. They had built their confidence on ignorance, and I was about to reveal the truth. The power of the deeds wasn't just in a single lot. I owned the entire block, all streets, corner parcels, utility corridors, and even easements carved out decades ago. Each survey line had legal precedence. Every easement granted me access rights. Subdivision carve-outs meant that while houses had been sold or built, the land beneath the roads remained under my grandfather's trust. HOA rules were irrelevant here. They had zero jurisdiction over property lines that were never theirs. I explained to the deputy, Notice the lines here. These utility corridors, these easements, this is my land. Any attempt to remove vehicles, enforce rules, or claim authority here is invalid, completely. The HOA president tried to interject, claiming authority over association roads and community rules, but I pointed to the plats. Every line, every measurement contradicted her argument. Her smugness faded. Panic flickered in her eyes, but she fought to maintain control. I reminded everyone quietly, this isn't about me being difficult. This is about following the law, respecting property, and acknowledging the truth written in public records. Even her board members started glancing at each other nervously. They could see what I saw. Their plan was unraveling. Every line on the survey maps was a thread pulling apart the entire facade they had built. I had prepared backup. A licensed surveyor and my attorney were on speakerphone, both confirming everything in real time. The surveyor's voice came clear over the deputy's radio. Lines confirmed. All parcels, streets, easements, and corners belong to Sam's family trust. No HOA authority applies here. I held a laser rangefinder, sweeping over the property corners marked with red flags. Each measurement aligned perfectly with the plats and the deed. The HOA president leaned forward, peering, trying to challenge the numbers, but they spoke louder than words. The attorney's voice followed, steady and calm. Any action by the HOA to remove vehicles or enforce regulations on Sam's property is legally unauthorized. They risk civil liability. Neighbors began quietly filming. Live streams started appearing on social media. For once, the evidence wasn't just on paper. It was visual, public, undeniable. The board members shifted, realizing the performance they had planned was crumbling. I gestured to the flags, the maps, and the documents. The physical layout of the land reinforced the legal documents in a way no HOA bluff could compete with. Every inch they thought they controlled belonged, legally, to my family. The deputy finally spoke, voice carrying authority. Ma'am, these documents show the property is legally owned by this gentleman. Your claim to remove vehicles or enforce rules here is invalid. The HOA president's face went pale. She tried to stammer, searching for a loophole, an excuse, any verbal lifeline, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her board members remained silent. Do you understand? The deputy asked firmly. Any action against this property without permission is trespassing. I suggest you step back. For the first time, the tables had turned. The HOA was no longer in control. Their bluff had been called, and the law had answered. Meanwhile, neighbor live streams went viral within minutes. People nearby stopped to watch, phones raised, cameras recording the meltdown. Local reporters arrived, curious about the confrontation. The HOA president attempted to narrate her side. We're just enforcing regulations, but her words faltered under the weight of documents, surveys, and the deputy's confirmation. Cameras caught every twitch, every glare, every failed attempt to intimidate. Social media lit up with commentary. HOA board caught lying. Property rights victory. That poor guy owns the block. For the first time, the community's gaze shifted. Sympathy was with me. The isolated victim turned rightful authority. The entire power structure the HOA had relied on evaporated in plain sight. The HOA president screamed, pivoting to threats, I'll sue, you can't prove. Every accusation failed against the cold, hard evidence. No one listened. Her authority collapsed in front of neighbors, deputies, media, and even her own board. Her screams echoed down the street, but they were hollow. The legal documents, the surveys, and the public attention had stripped her of power. She was now a villain in her own spectacle. Her board members cowered quietly, realizing the consequences of their overreach. The deputy leaned slightly forward, calm and precise. Ma'am, you trespassed him. Remove yourself from the property immediately. Tow trucks, stand down. The tow drivers hesitated, then pulled back, engines growling as if defeated. The HOA president froze, realizing her performance had failed utterly. I stayed quiet, letting the silence reinforce the outcome. The authority I had inherited and meticulously documented had neutralized the board's years of assumed dominance. As the chaos settled, I revealed one final fact. The HOA had been illegally encroaching on a drainage easement for years. Local ordinances confirmed it. Any prior claims, fences, or access restrictions imposed by them on that easement were invalid. Neighbors murmured, cameras capturing the final twist. The block I had inherited was now fully secured, not just legally but publicly. The HOA had been exposed, their authority stripped, and every overreach documented for future legal action. The air was different after that day, quiet, charged, almost reverent. The street that had been a battlefield of surveillance, citations, and whispered threats now felt like the property it was meant to be. my family's block, legally and undeniably secured. The HOA didn't just lose authority, they were dismantled. Within days, the county levied fines for their repeated harassment, illegal citations, and unauthorized use of surveillance equipment. The board members were removed from their positions, unable to argue against the overwhelming evidence of overreach. The public record documented every misstep, from doctored letters to attempted intimidation, leaving no room for them to maneuver. And then there was Karen, the so-called president, whose confidence had filled every letter, email, and meeting, now faced the consequences of her obsession. She resigned immediately, her silver SUV never appearing again on my block. The resignation was quiet in tone, but the humiliation was loud. Local newspapers reported on the entire confrontation, her attempted enforcement of rules over land she had no authority to control, her meltdown in front of deputies and neighbors, and the legal documentation proving her actions were invalid. The threat of civil suits lingered over her like a storm cloud. Every lawsuit filed against her for trespassing, harassment, and attempted illegal towing became public knowledge. Her once smug expression, the one that had mocked me in every board meeting, had been replaced by uncertainty, regret, and avoidance. I saw her once, weeks later, walking past the street head down, no camera, no clipboard, no authority. Just a person confronted by the weight of her own misjudgments. Public humiliation isn't always a dramatic scream or viral video. Sometimes it's quieter, everyone knowing, silently judging, remembering every overreach and threat. Karen had that. Every neighbor, every passerby, every live-streamed video kept the memory alive. Her arrogance had crumbled, replaced with a cautious, diminished presence that served as a stark reminder of what happens when authority is wielded without legitimacy. The other board members fared little better. Some quietly moved away, some attempted legal appeals that were dismissed. Their carefully constructed network of control, designed to intimidate and isolate me, had completely collapsed under the weight of evidence, law, and patience. They had underestimated the combination of property rights, preparation, and calm persistence. And the community saw it all. Neighbors who had hesitated to speak now came forward, apologizing for the silence, for the moments they doubted me, for letting fear control their actions. They had witnessed firsthand the dangers of unchallenged HOA authority, and the consequences of attempting to bully someone whose knowledge and rights were unassailable. For me, the sense of vindication was profound but tempered. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. Watching the block return to normal, seeing Karen disappear from the street, hearing about fines levied and board removals completed, I felt the full weight of accountability in a way that was deeply satisfying. The street itself seemed to breathe again. Mailboxes no longer carried threats, fences stood where they were supposed to, and the driveways were free from cameras and unwarranted scrutiny. The very land my grandfather had protected for decades finally had the respect it deserved. Even as I walked the block alone that evening, I could sense the lingering respect from neighbors who had previously avoided my gaze. They nodded politely, some smiling, acknowledging the quiet restoration of order. The balance of power had shifted, and it was permanent. I kept the deeds and documents carefully, knowing that vigilance is eternal. But for the first time in months, the tension was gone. Karen had learned the hard way that authority without legitimacy is fragile, and the HOA board had learned that intimidation fails when met with preparation, knowledge, and calm persistence. After the chaos of the confrontation and the board's collapse, the block slowly began to breathe again. The air felt lighter, the sun brighter, as if the neighborhood itself was exhaling after holding its breath for months. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for fear of the HOA finally smiled and waved. Their apologies were quiet at first, hesitant. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner," one elderly neighbor said, leaning on her cane. "I didn't know who to trust. I should have told them off months ago," a young father admitted as his children ran down the sidewalk, laughing. These small acknowledgments were more than just words. They were the first threads of healing, tiny admissions that validated the struggle I had endured. The community was beginning to reclaim its voice, its sense of agency, its confidence. With the HOA board gone and Karen resigned, the energy of the neighborhood shifted. Families emerged from behind closed doors. Kids who had been kept inside by fear now raced down the streets on bikes and scooters, their laughter echoing against the houses. Balloons and small banners appeared in driveways. Flags marking reclaimed territory, symbols of resilience. One Saturday, neighbors organized a block gathering. Tables were set up in the cul-de-sac, picnic blankets spread across well-manicured lawn. Homemade snacks circulated, laughter rippled through the air, and a sense of camaraderie returned that had been missing for years. People shared stories of the harassment, of letters and warnings, and of how fear had kept them isolated. But now, together, they celebrated freedom, justice, and community solidarity. Flowers were planted along the curbs and in small garden patches that had been neglected during the HOA's reign of intimidation. Bright marigolds, pansies, and daisies reflected in sunlight, creating bursts of color against sidewalks that had once felt sterile and surveilled. Flags, some hand-painted, adorned lampposts and gates. Each one was a silent declaration: this land belonged to its people, and it would no longer be governed by fear. Repairs to the roads and shared infrastructure began quickly. Neighbors volunteered tools and labor, fixing potholes, clearing drainage ditches, and repainting street lines. Every improvement was a small victory, a visual representation that the block was no longer just a set of houses, it was a community. I spent time walking the streets myself, observing the subtle transformations. A father teaching his son to ride a bike, a mother chatting with a neighbor across the fence, children playing in sprinklers under the sun. These were ordinary moments, but after months of tension they felt extraordinary. They were proof that normalcy, safety, and joy could return after the disruption. Even the mailboxes, once plastered with warnings and orange stickers, now carried greetings, small gifts, and notes of appreciation. Neighbors began leaving invitations to barbecues and weekend breakfasts, simple gestures that felt monumental after months of isolation. By the end of the first month, the street felt alive again, vibrant with human presence rather than fear. The cameras and drones were gone, their signals replaced by trust and familiarity. I could see the pride in the neighbors' eyes, the subtle way they now looked at the block. Not as property under some arbitrary authority, but as something shared, protected, and owned collectively. It was more than just reclaiming space, it was reclaiming dignity. The block, once suffocated under petty fines, surveillance, and intimidation, was now breathing with life, laughter, and shared humanity. Each smile, each wave, each small celebration was a reminder that the community had survived, and even thrived, despite months of harassment. Walking back to my own home that evening, I paused at a corner where a group of kids had tied colorful ribbons around a lamppost. The sun cast long shadows, painting the street in warm hues. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not in retaliation, not in the downfall of the HOA, but in the quiet, visible restoration of life, freedom, and community. This was what victory felt like, not in legal documents alone, not in fines or resignations, but in the laughter of children, the restored gardens, the simple human connections that had been threatened. The block was healed, and with it, the heart of the community. After the block had begun to breathe again, I found myself drawn back to the quiet corners of the property, to the small spaces that had witnessed generations of my family's care. The neighborhood bustle, the children's laughter, neighbors chatting, flags fluttering, created a living soundtrack of recovery, but I needed something quieter, something that reminded me why I had returned in the first place. I sat on the old wooden bench beneath the oak at the edge of the main lawn, one my grandfather had planted decades ago, its thick branches swaying gently in the breeze. I opened his leather-bound journal, the pages soft and slightly yellowed with age. Each line was handwritten, meticulous, reflecting a mind that valued patience, observation, and endurance. His words flowed like a map of the land itself, notes on soil quality, water flow, survey markers, even small reflections about neighbors and community. He wrote not just about property, but about stewardship, about care, about legacy. I traced a finger along a note he had penned in the margin. Land is more than soil and fences, it's history, responsibility, and heart. That simple line struck me with the weight of decades. Everything I had fought to protect, the streets, the fences, the easements, even the battle with the HOA, was an extension of that philosophy. My grandfather hadn't just left me deeds and plats, he had left me a responsibility to honor the history embedded in every corner of this block. I closed the journal carefully, savoring the creak of the spine, the soft smell of aged paper. Then I stood, stretching, and turned my attention to the gate at the entrance of the property. Though functional, it had been worn from years of neglect, and I wanted it to reflect more than security. I wanted it to be a symbol. I rolled up my sleeves and took to the repairs myself, tightening the bolts, sanding the rough edges, repainting the panels in deep, rich brown. With each stroke of the brush, I felt the weight of history being reaffirmed, the hands of my grandfather, my parents, and now mine, all caring for the same piece of land. Once the gate was secure and polished, I stepped back and surveyed the entrance. The sunlight reflected off the freshly painted wood, glinting on the metal latch. The gate wasn't just a barrier, it was a statement, protection, legacy, and respect. Next I turned to a small clearing near the center of the block. I had purchased an oak sapling weeks earlier, a new addition to the line of trees my grandfather had begun decades ago. Kneeling in the rich soil, I dug carefully, placing the roots gently into the earth. As I filled the hole, I whispered quietly, a promise more to the land than to anyone else. Grow strong. Stand tall. Watch over this block as we do. I pressed the soil firmly, watered the sapling, and took a moment to trace my hand along its tender trunk. This tree would grow slowly, like my family's legacy, a living reminder of resilience and care for generations to come. I looked around and saw children running toward the small pond at the far end of the block. A few were dragging small nets, hoping to spot minnows, while others skipped stones across the water's reflective surface. Their laughter carried across the block, mingling with the rustle of leaves and the hum of spring insects. I gestured for a few of them to come closer, showing them how to gently feed the ducks without startling them, and pointing out the reeds along the shoreline where frogs like to hide. Nearby, a small playground I had helped install after clearing debris now hosted a group of kids swinging and climbing, their voices high and free. One child waved at me, shy but curious, and I waved back. Watching them, I realized that victory wasn't only in legal documents or fines, it was in these moments of ordinary joy, in the safety and freedom of the community we had preserved. I spent the afternoon repairing and repainting benches, moving planters filled with flowers, and ensuring that the small walking paths were smooth and safe. Every action was meditative, a way to reconnect not only with the land but with the people and history it held. It wasn't work in the sense of labor, it was work in the sense of care, mindfulness, and restoration. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the block, I sat again on the original bench beneath the old oak. I opened my grandfather's journal once more, reading passages about his early efforts to map the land, to ensure that each parcel was accounted for, that every street corner, ditch, and easement was correctly marked. I imagined him walking these same streets, perhaps dreaming of a day when the land would be safe from interference, and I felt a deep connection across time, a bridge between his care, my efforts, and the generations that would follow. The community had returned to life around me. Families laughed, kids played, neighbors shared stories. The flags I had helped raise waved gently in the breeze. Flowers shone in the sunlight, and the roads were smooth and clear. I leaned back, taking in the entire block, and felt a rare sense of completion. The legal battle, the confrontations, the harassment, all of it had culminated in something tangible, beautiful, and enduring. Finally, I placed my hand gently on the oak sapling I had planted. "This is for you, Grandpa," I whispered. "For the land you loved, the legacy you protected, and the family you trusted." As night fell, I looked around the block one last time. The lights from houses glowed warmly, reflecting on the calm pond. Children's laughter faded into quiet chatter, neighbors exchanged smiles, and I felt a profound sense of peace. The property was safe. The community was healed. And the story of my grandfather's land, our shared legacy, would continue to grow, just like the oak I had planted. The battle was over, but the work of stewardship, care, and presence would never end. I had won not just a confrontation, but the trust, respect, and harmony of a community, and I knew, as I closed the journal for the final time that evening, that this was only the beginning of keeping that promise alive for generations to come. As the last of the neighborhood lights flickered on, and the sun began its slow descent, I walked the length of the block one final time. The shadows stretched long across the freshly restored streets, the pond's surface catching the orange glow of the fading sun. Everything felt still, quiet, as if the land itself were exhaling after months of tension. I paused at the top of the hill overlooking the block. From here, I could see the repaired gate, the blooming flowers lining each driveway, children's swings moving gently in the evening breeze, and the small oak sapling standing proudly beside the old tree my grandfather had planted. It all felt like a living mosaic of care, patience, and hard-won justice. Holding my grandfather's journal in my hand, I reflected on the journey. Months of harassment, intimidation, and petty rules had tested my patience and resolve. But in the end, it wasn't sheer force or anger that won. It was preparation, knowledge, and calm persistence. Power had been measured not in authority letters or loud voices, but in paperwork, deeds, plats, surveys, and trust documents. Bullies can scream, threaten, and intimidate, but they cannot rewrite history or override legal rights. I thought back to the HOA president's smug confidence, the way she had strutted through the streets, believing her clipboard could dictate reality. It was almost cinematic how quickly that confidence crumbled when confronted by truth. Watching it unfold reminded me that authority is fragile when it lacks legitimacy, and that careful, persistent preparation can flip the scales in the quietest, most effective way. There was satisfaction here, but it wasn't the kind that It was quiet, internal, a calm, rooted in justice done, in the land restored, in neighbors feeling safe and free again. The moral was clear, and I whispered it to myself as the wind rustled through the trees. Never let bullies hold the pen. They may try to write the story, but the truth is always on record. I looked back at the block one last time before heading toward my porch. I could see neighbors lingering outside, exchanging smiles and stories, kids racing to catch the last sunlight over the pond, flags swaying gently in the evening breeze. Everything was alive, restored, and free. If you've ever faced an HOA nightmare, bullying neighbors, or anyone who tried to intimidate you with false authority, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and let the community know how you stood your ground or what lessons you learned. And if you want more stories like this, real people standing up to authority, reclaiming their land, and flipping the tables on bullies, make sure to hit subscribe. There are more blocks, more confrontations, and more victories waiting to be shared. Finally, I paused to capture the last rays of the sun over the entire block. The golden light reflected off rooftops, sidewalks, and the pond. In that moment, I felt it all: the history, the struggle, the victory, the healing. This block, my grandfather's legacy, our restored community, was a testament to patience, preparation, and quiet resilience. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, warm shadows over the streets and gardens, I took a deep breath, content in the knowledge that this chapter was closed, but the story, the care, and the vigilance would live on.